The evening sun cast long shadows across the pristine exterior of a brand-new Mercedes-Benz S-Class, its metallic paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the Shell gas station. Behind the wheel sat Michelle Anderson, a woman who had worked her way up from a tiny basement office to becoming one of the city's most respected tech consultants. Her success story wasn't just about the fancy car, it was about breaking barriers in an industry that hadn't always welcomed faces like hers. As she pulled up to pump number 4, Michelle couldn't help but smile, remembering the moment she'd first walked into that dealership. The salesman had barely given her a second glance until she'd mentioned her company's name. That's when their attitudes had changed, but Michelle was used to it. She'd built her reputation by staying focused and letting her work speak for itself. The gas station was relatively quiet for a Thursday evening, with just a couple of other cars filling up. Michelle grabbed her designer purse, a gift from her mother to celebrate landing her biggest client yet, and headed inside to pay. The air conditioning hit her face with a welcoming blast as she pushed open the glass door, the little bell above it announcing her presence. That's when she first noticed him, Officer Conway, leaning against his patrol car, his eyes fixed on her Mercedes. Something about his gaze made her uneasy, but Michelle had learned long ago not to let such things rattle her. She'd done nothing wrong, and this was her car, bought and paid for with years of hard work and determination. Inside the store, while waiting to pay for her gas, Michelle chatted with the elderly cashier about the unseasonably warm weather. Through the window, she could see Officer Conway circling her car, his hand resting on his belt as he peered through the windows. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She'd seen this movie before, and she knew exactly how these scenes typically played out. Taking a deep breath, Michelle pulled out her phone and opened her camera app, making sure it was ready to record if needed. She'd learned from her father, a retired school principal, that documentation was often the best protection. As she collected her receipt from the cashier, she quickly texted her location to her brother, a successful attorney who had helped many others in similar situations. The automatic doors slid open, and Michelle stepped back into the humid evening air. Officer Conway was already moving toward her, his face set in what she recognized as his official expression. She could feel the eyes of other customers on them, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion replay of something they'd seen too many times before. Michelle squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, the way her grandmother had taught her. She was a successful business owner, a respected community member, and she had every right to be exactly where she was. The key fob to her Mercedes felt warm in her palm as she gripped it tightly, knowing the next few moments would likely determine how this evening would unfold. In her mind, she could hear her mother's voice reminding her to stay calm and composed, to let wisdom guide her actions rather than emotion. As Officer Conway approached, Michelle noticed his name tag catching the light from the gas station's overhead lamps. She made a mental note of his badge number, another lesson learned from years of navigating similar situations. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and even the usual background noise of traffic and gas station operations seemed to fade away. Other customers slowed their movements, some pretending to check their phones while keeping a watchful eye on the unfolding situation. This moment, Michelle realized, was about to become much more than just a routine stop for gas. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your license and registration right now." Officer Conway's voice carried across the gas station lot, loud enough that the couple at the next pump turned to watch. He stood with his hand resting near his belt, eyes fixed on Michelle with that look she'd seen too many times before. Michelle kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her purse. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Her voice remained steady, though her heart was racing. Years of similar encounters had taught her exactly how to handle these situations. "This vehicle matches the description of one that was reported stolen earlier today," Conway replied, his tone carrying an edge of authority that seemed unnecessary for a simple vehicle check. Michelle noticed how he positioned himself, slightly too close, trying to tower over her despite her professional attire and calm demeanor. As she pulled out her wallet, Michelle could feel more eyes on them. The teenage clerk had stopped restocking the shelves to watch through the window. An elderly man getting coffee inside had paused mid-pour. These moments always seemed to draw an audience, she thought, carefully extracting her license and the car's registration. Everything's right here, officer, Michelle said, holding out the documents. I purchased this car 3 months ago from downtown Mercedes. I'm happy to show you the bill of sale as well. She kept her phone recording in her pocket, its camera lens barely visible but capturing everything. Conway snatched the papers from her hand, studying them with exaggerated scrutiny. This registration looks new, he said, as if that was somehow suspicious. Step away from the vehicle. Officer, I can call the dealership right now. They'll confirm everything. Michelle stood her ground, maintaining eye contact. She'd worked too hard to be treated this way. I'm sure you're just doing your job, but I am the legal owner of this car. The officer's face hardened. Ma'am, I said, step away from the vehicle. We've had reports of people using fake documents lately. His hand moved to his radio, and Michelle knew exactly what was coming next. Dispatch, I'm going to need backup at the Shell station on 5th. More customers were gathering now, phones discreetly raised. A woman in scrubs had stopped filling her tank to watch, her face showing concern. 2 businessmen leaving the store slowed their pace, clearly troubled by what they were witnessing. Officer Conway, Michelle said, reading his nameplate clearly for her recording, I understand you're investigating a stolen vehicle report, but I can prove this is my car right now. I have the dealership's number, the insurance paperwork, even photos from the day I bought it. But Conway wasn't listening anymore. His backup call had been made, and his mind seemed set on a particular version of events that no amount of evidence could change. Until we verify these documents, I need to secure this vehicle. You're going to have to come down to the station. Michelle felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination rising in her chest. Her brother, a well-known civil rights attorney, had warned her about situations exactly like this. Officer, she said firmly, I do not consent to any searches or seizures of my property. I've provided valid documentation of ownership, and I'm formally requesting you call your supervisor to the scene. The evening air grew thick with tension as more patrol cars approached in the distance, their lights reflecting off the gas station's windows. Michelle stood tall, her phone still recording, knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would matter not just for her, but for everyone watching this scene unfold. The phone in Michelle's hand felt warm as she continued recording, her fingers steady despite the tension building in her chest. She'd dealt with difficult situations before in her business career, but this was different. The growing crowd at the gas station had created an audience she hadn't asked for, but in a way, they were now her witnesses. Officer Conway, I'm live streaming this interaction right now, she said calmly, holding her phone where he could clearly see it. I've shown you my registration, insurance, and license. I've offered to contact the dealership. What else do you need to verify that this is my car? Conway's face twitched slightly at the mention of live streaming. He glanced around, suddenly more aware of the numerous phones pointed in their direction. The evening had turned into something he hadn't planned for, but instead of backing down, he seemed to dig in deeper. Put the phone down, he ordered, his voice carrying across the parking lot. You're interfering with an official investigation. 2 more patrol cars had pulled up, their lights casting rotating blue and red shadows across the scene. Michelle noticed how the extra officers held back, reading the situation before jumping in. A young woman in medical scrubs stepped forward from the crowd. I've been here the whole time, she called out. She's done nothing wrong. She's just trying to get gas. Others murmured in agreement, their presence creating a protective circle of witnesses. Michelle kept her voice steady as she spoke into her phone. I'm at the Shell station on 5th Street. The time is 7:42 p.m. Officer Conway is attempting to seize my vehicle despite being shown proper documentation of ownership. She turned to Conway. My brother, who you should know is a civil rights attorney, is already on his way. That's when Conway made his move. Step aside, he barked, reaching for the driver's door of her Mercedes. This vehicle needs to be impounded until ownership can be verified. His hand gripped the door handle, the action causing a ripple of shocked voices from the onlookers. You're making a mistake, Michelle warned, her voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what was about to unfold. Everything you're doing is being recorded from multiple angles. Think carefully about your next move. The crowd had grown larger now. A city bus had stopped across the street, its passengers pressing against the windows to watch. The gas station's night manager had come outside, phone in hand, likely calling the district manager. This had become bigger than just one officer and one driver. Conway yanked open the car door, the smooth mechanical sound cutting through the evening air. "This vehicle is being seized as evidence," he announced, trying to make it sound official. "You can reclaim it at the station once we complete our investigation." Michelle's phone buzzed. A text from her brother. "Don't move. 2 minutes away with a news crew from Channel 5. Keep recording." She allowed herself a small smile, knowing help was close. But Conway was already sliding into her car's driver's seat, his actions becoming more rushed as if he sensed time running out. "Officer Conway," Michelle projected her voice so everyone could hear, "you are now attempting to steal my vehicle under color of law. I have documentation proving ownership. Multiple witnesses are recording. The media is on their way. This is your last chance to handle this professionally." The evening air crackled with tension. Some of the other officers were shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure about how this situation had escalated so quickly. In the distance, the distinct sound of news vans could be heard approaching, their satellite dishes visible above the traffic. Michelle stood her ground, phone steady, documenting everything. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes standing tall is the only weapon you need." She watched as Conway gripped her steering wheel, his face now showing the first signs of doubt as the sound of media vehicles grew closer. The rumble of Conway's engine starting cut through the evening air as he began pulling away in Michelle's Mercedes. But something had changed in the atmosphere. The quiet crowd had found its voice. People were shouting now, their phones recording every moment of this outrageous scene. "He's really stealing her car," someone yelled from the growing crowd. The young nurse in scrubs was already sharing her video on social media, her fingers moving quickly across her phone screen. "This is going viral right now," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Michelle remained surprisingly calm, her own phone still recording, as she quickly sent the live stream link to her brother. Her hands didn't shake. Years of dealing with difficult board meetings had taught her that composure was her greatest ally. The text she received back was simple, "Almost there. News vans right behind me. Keep recording." The gas station had turned into something like a movie set. Cars were pulling over just to witness what was happening, and the evening traffic had slowed to a crawl as drivers tried to make sense of the scene. The station's owner had come out now, offering Michelle his own footage from the security cameras. "I've got all the angles," he said, standing beside her. "Been recording since he first started circling your car. This isn't right, and everybody here knows it." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many similar incidents at his business. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, but these weren't police lights. News vans from 3 different stations were pulling into the lot, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky like metal trees. Behind them, a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt, and Michelle's brother stepped out, his suit jacket flapping in the evening breeze. Conway had made it about 2 blocks in Michelle's car when he must have noticed the commotion in his rearview mirror. The Mercedes brake lights flashed as he slowed, probably realizing that his simple plan had spiraled far beyond his control. The city streets had become his stage, and he was losing his audience fast. "We've got over 10,000 people watching this live right now," someone in the crowd announced, their voice carrying across the parking lot. The number seemed to ripple through the gathering, phones being raised higher, more cameras focusing on the scene. Michelle's brother was already in action, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of handling similar cases. He brought not just news crews, but also 2 other attorneys from his firm. They moved with purpose, their presence changing the energy of the entire situation. "The police chief has been notified," he announced to the crowd, his phone still at his ear. "And I'm getting calls from national news networks. They're picking up the live stream." He turned to Michelle, his expression both concerned and determined. "You okay?" The Mercedes brake lights flashed again, brighter this time. Conway was making a U-turn, the expensive car moving slowly like a reluctant dancer. The crowd watched in tense silence as the vehicle approached the gas station again, its headlights cutting through the growing dusk. Local reporters were setting up their cameras now, their microphones ready. The story was growing bigger by the minute, spreading across social media like wildfire. Comments and shares were flooding in, the incident becoming a real-time example of everything wrong with abuse of power. "Look at his face," someone whispered as Conway pulled back into the gas station. Through the Mercedes windshield, everyone could see it, the look of a man who just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. His confident smirk from earlier had vanished, replaced by something between panic and regret. The evening had transformed from a simple gas station stop into a moment that would be talked about for months to come. As Conway parked the car, the cameras moved closer, ready to capture whatever came next. The power had shifted, and everyone knew it, especially Officer Conway. The gas station's fluorescent lights seemed brighter now as Conway stepped out of Michelle's Mercedes, his movements stiff and uncertain. The news crews had their cameras trained on him, their bright lights adding to the surreal atmosphere. The story was no longer just about a car, it had become about accountability in real time. Michelle's brother stepped forward, his legal pad already in hand. Behind him, 3 different news channels were going live, their reporters speaking quietly but urgently into their microphones. The young nurse who'd been recording earlier was now being interviewed, gesturing animatedly as she described what she'd witnessed. "The security footage is clear," the gas station owner announced, holding up his tablet. The cameras had caught everything. Conway's initial suspicious circling, the invalid vehicle check, the baseless accusations, and finally, the unauthorized taking of the vehicle. The evidence was stacking up like building blocks, each piece making the situation worse for Conway. The crowd had grown even larger, with people sharing clips and posting updates online. "It's trending nationwide," someone called out, scrolling through their phone. "People are sharing it everywhere." The incident had touched a nerve, becoming a symbol of something much bigger than just one officer's poor judgment. Through the chaos, Michelle remained composed, her phone still recording as Conway approached. His earlier confidence had evaporated like morning dew, replaced by what looked like desperate calculation. He kept glancing at the news cameras, then at the growing crowd, seeming to search for an escape route that didn't exist. "Listen," Conway began, his voice notably softer now, almost pleading. "Let's handle this professionally. There's no need for all these cameras." But his words were drowned out by the arrival of more police vehicles, this time including a familiar black SUV that made him freeze mid-sentence. The police chief stepped out, his face set in grim lines as he surveyed the scene. He'd clearly been pulled away from something important, his formal dinner attire visible under his hastily donned police jacket. The look he gave Conway spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "My office has received 17 calls about this incident in the last 10 minutes, the chief announced, his voice carrying across the now quiet crowd. Plus calls from 3 news networks and the mayor's office. He turned to Conway, whose face had gone pale. "Officer, step aside for a moment." The gas station owner was already showing the security footage to the chief on his tablet. The images were crystal clear. There had been no justification, no probable cause, just a series of increasingly poor decisions caught on multiple cameras. The chief's expression darkened with each passing second. Michelle's brother had his team documenting everything, taking statements from witnesses who were eager to share what they'd seen. The young nurse handed over her footage, explaining how she'd watched the whole thing unfold. Others stepped forward too, each with their own recordings, their own perspectives on what had happened. The vehicle was never reported stolen, another officer confirmed, checking the police database on his laptop. There's no record of any similar vehicles being reported today. This announcement sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. Conway's last excuse had just crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. Conway began to speak again, this time directing his words to Michelle. "Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience," but the chief cut him off with a raised hand. This wasn't the time for half-hearted apologies. The situation had grown far beyond what simple words could fix. The evening news crews were setting up for their main broadcasts now. This story would lead their evening reports. A clear example of what happens when power meets accountability in the age of smartphones and social media. Conway stood alone near Michelle's car, watching as his career seemed to unravel in real time under the unforgiving glare of the gas station lights. The police chief's face was a storm cloud as he reviewed the footage one more time on the gas station owner's tablet. Around him, the evening had turned into something like a community gathering, with people from all walks of life united in their concern over what they'd witnessed. The news reporters were doing live updates every few minutes, their voices carrying the story across the city. Over 50,000 people watching now, someone announced, checking their phone. The number seemed to hit Conway like a physical blow. He stood awkwardly by the patrol car, his earlier authority replaced by the nervous energy of someone watching their mistakes play out on a national stage. Michelle's brother was in full lawyer mode, his team collecting witness statements as efficiently as they gathered business cards. "We've got doctors, teachers, business owners, all willing to testify about what they saw," he told the police chief. The evidence was becoming an avalanche, and Conway was standing right in its path. The gas station's security cameras had caught everything in perfect detail. The footage played on the tablet, showing Conway's unnecessary circling of the car, his aggressive approach, and finally, the moment he drove away in a vehicle he had no right to take. Each frame was another nail in the coffin of his career. "Officer Conway," the chief's voice cut through the evening air like a knife, "turn in your badge and gun. Right now." The words fell heavy in the sudden silence. Even the reporters lowered their microphones, sensing the weight of the moment. Conway's face drained of color as the reality of his situation finally seemed to sink in. As Conway slowly removed his badge, a young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is this what justice looks like?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The innocent question brought tears to several eyes in the crowd. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about change happening in real time. The nurse who'd recorded everything was being interviewed by a national news network now. "I couldn't just stand there and watch," she explained, her scrubs still on from her hospital shift. "We all have to stand up when we see something wrong. That's how things change." Michelle stood tall through it all, her phone still recording as Conway handed over his badge and gun. She'd faced discrimination before in the business world, but this was different. This time, the community had rallied around her, technology had empowered her, and justice was being served right before everyone's eyes. The chief turned to address the crowd and the cameras. "What happened here tonight is not what our department stands for," he declared firmly. "We are here to protect and serve all members of our community. What Officer Conway did," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "will be fully investigated and appropriate action will be taken." Conway tried one last time to salvage something from the situation. "Chief, if we could just discuss this in private." But his words faded as the chief held up a hand, pointing to the dozens of phones still recording, the news cameras broadcasting live, and the security footage playing on repeat on the gas station's screens. The evening had become a lesson in accountability. People were already sharing their stories online, talking about similar experiences, and praising the community's response. The gas station owner had brought out water for everyone, turning what could have been just another incident into a moment of community solidarity. As the chief led Conway away to a waiting patrol car, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many came up to Michelle to offer their support and contact information. The news crews were wrapping up their live broadcasts, but the story was far from over. It had already taken on a life of its own across social media, becoming a symbol of hope for change. Conway's face had lost all its color as he watched his 15-year career crumbling before his eyes. The chief's words still rang in his ears, and the weight of dozens of cameras recording his downfall made his knees weak. He'd seen other officers face similar situations, but he'd always thought he was smarter, that he'd never be caught in such a position. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached Michelle and her brother. "Maybe we can work something out." Gone was the authoritative tone he used earlier. Now he sounded like a completely different person, desperate, afraid, and suddenly very aware of how badly he'd misjudged the situation. The news reporters pressed closer, their microphones stretching out like eager hands reaching for every word. One of them, a veteran journalist who'd covered police stories for 20 years, was already comparing this incident to other famous cases of police misconduct on live television. "You had multiple chances to do the right thing," Michelle's brother responded, his voice firm but professional. "First, when you saw the valid registration. Second, when witnesses started recording. Third, when you were told I was on my way. Instead, you chose to escalate at every turn. The gas station had become a sort of town hall meeting. People were sharing their own stories of similar encounters, their voices carrying across the parking lot. The young nurse who'd recorded everything was now being interviewed by a national news network, her story of standing up for what's right inspiring viewers across the country. Conway ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. I was just following protocol, he tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The chief, still standing nearby, shook his head in disappointment. Protocol? The chief interrupted. Show me where in the protocol it says to ignore valid registration, refuse to call a supervisor, and drive away in someone's car. His words carried the weight of 3 decades of service, making Conway shrink even further into himself. The live stream counter kept climbing, hundreds of thousands of viewers now watching this moment of accountability unfold in real time. Comments were flooding in from across the country, many sharing similar stories, others expressing relief at seeing justice served so swiftly. Officer Conway, Michelle spoke up, her voice steady and clear. This isn't about ruining your career. This is about making sure what happened here tonight never happens to anyone else. Her words carried no anger, just a determined resolve that made several observers nod in agreement. The police union representative who'd just arrived looked grim as he reviewed the footage on his tablet. There would be no defending these actions, no way to spin this story. Conway had crossed too many lines, violated too many protocols, and it had all been caught on camera from multiple angles. I have a family, Conway pleaded, his voice cracking. A mortgage. Please, there must be something we can do. But as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, the concerned citizens, the determined reporters, the disappointed chief, he knew there was no going back. The evening air had grown cooler, but nobody was leaving. This moment felt too important, too meaningful to walk away from. Parents were using it as a teaching moment for their children, explaining about rights and responsibilities. Teachers in the crowd were already planning how to discuss this in their classrooms tomorrow. The chief stepped forward one final time, his face set in stone. Officer Conway, you're immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Turn in your gun and badge. The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet night air, each one another nail in the coffin of Conway's career. Time seemed to slow down as the police chief stepped in front of the news cameras. The gas station's bright lights illuminated his serious expression as he prepared to make an official statement. Behind him, Conway sat in the back of a patrol car, his head in his hands, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Let me be clear, the chief began, his voice firm and unwavering. What happened here tonight is completely unacceptable. On behalf of our entire department, I want to apologize to the victim of this incident. He paused, making eye contact with the cameras to emphasize his next words. Effective immediately, we're implementing new training protocols and oversight measures. The crowd had thinned slightly, but those who remained were fully invested in this moment of accountability. The gas station owner was still sharing the security footage with reporters, each viewing adding another layer to the story. The crystal-clear video left no room for doubt or alternative interpretations. Michelle stood with her brother, receiving the chief's words with quiet dignity. Her phone had finally stopped recording, but others kept their cameras up, documenting every moment of this unexpected evening. The young nurse who'd first spoken up was now being hailed as a community hero on social media. The department will be conducting a full investigation, the chief continued, his words carefully measured. But I can tell you now that Officer Conway's actions tonight were not just against our policies, they violated the trust between law enforcement and the community we serve. The city's mayor had arrived by now, having cut short a dinner engagement to address the situation. She moved through the crowd, speaking quietly with witnesses, showing the kind of leadership that people remembered during election seasons. Her presence underscored the significance of what had transpired. Your car keys, ma'am, another officer said, approaching Michelle with professional courtesy. He handed over the Mercedes keys with a respectful nod. We've verified everything, though we obviously knew it was yours from the start. I'm truly sorry for my colleague's actions. The news reporters were already calling this a watershed moment for the community. Their live broadcasts captured the mixed emotions in the crowd, relief at seeing justice served, sadness that such incidents still occurred, and hope that real change might finally be happening. Conway's patrol car pulled away quietly, carrying him toward an uncertain future. The gathered crowd watched it disappear into the night, many feeling they'd witnessed something important, not just an ending, but perhaps the beginning of something new. The security footage, witness statements, and social media videos will all be part of our official review, the chief announced, wrapping up his statement. We're also launching a broader examination of our department's practices. This incident has shown us where we need to improve. The gas station was starting to return to normal, but it would never be just another gas station again. People were already calling it a landmark. The place where one person's stand for justice had sparked a larger conversation about accountability and respect. Michelle's brother was organizing the witness statements and contact information they'd collected. His legal team had enough evidence to ensure this incident wouldn't be forgotten or brushed aside. The system that had failed at first had been forced to correct itself thanks to technology and community action. As Michelle finally prepared to leave, several people approached to share words of support. The simple act of stopping for gas had turned into something much more significant, a moment that would be discussed in homes, schools, and community meetings for months to come. 1 month after the gas station incident, the community gathered in the City Hall's main conference room. The space was packed with residents, reporters, and community leaders, all there to witness something remarkable. Michelle stood at the podium, her presence commanding attention just as it had that fateful evening. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "What was unique was that it was caught on camera, and a community stood up to say enough." The crowd nodded in agreement, many remembering their own roles in that evening's events. The changes had come swiftly after that night. Conway had been officially terminated from the force following a thorough investigation. But more importantly, the incident had sparked real reform. The police department had implemented new training programs, body camera requirements, and community oversight measures. The young nurse who'd first spoken up that night was now part of a newly formed citizen review board. "When I started recording that evening, I never imagined it would lead to all this," she told a reporter. It shows how one person standing up can make a real difference. Michelle had taken her experience and turned it into something positive. She'd established a non-profit organization focused on building bridges between law enforcement and the community. The gas station owner had donated the space next to his station for their first office, turning the site of the incident into a symbol of progress. "Our organization isn't about pointing fingers," Michelle explained to the gathered crowd. "It's about creating understanding, ensuring accountability, and building trust." Behind her, slides showed the program's early successes, community meetings, youth outreach programs, and training sessions attended by both officers and residents. The police chief had become one of the program's strongest supporters. "What happened that night showed us where we needed to improve," he acknowledged. "But it also showed us the power of community when people stand together for what's right." The gas station had become something of a local landmark. People would point it out to visitors, telling the story of how one incident had sparked real change. The owner had put up a small plaque, "Where community unity made a difference, summer 2024. The story had reached far beyond their city. Other communities had started implementing similar programs, using what happened that night as a blueprint for their own reforms. Michelle's brother's law firm had created a free app that helped people know their rights and properly document interactions with law enforcement. The most powerful thing that came from that night wasn't the videos or the news coverage, Michelle told the gathering. It was the reminder that when we stand together, when we use technology responsibly, when we demand accountability, real change is possible. As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. The mayor stepped forward to sign new legislation that would make many of the emergency reforms permanent. Reporters' cameras flashed, capturing the moment for tomorrow's headlines, but this wasn't about publicity anymore. It was about lasting change. Outside City Hall, life went on as usual. People still stopped at that same gas station, many now noticing the plaque for the first time. But something had shifted in the community's DNA. People looked out for each other more, spoke up more readily when they saw something wrong, and believed more strongly in the power of unity. Michelle still drove her Mercedes, but now it carried a small bumper sticker. See something, say something, change something. It was a simple message, but it captured the spirit of that evening and everything that had followed. One person's stand for justice had become a community's movement for change.